Hi everyone, I'm Mark, and today we're going to start working on a new replacement for this old workbench. This simple rolling workbench is one of the first things that I built when I moved into this shop. The bench is almost entirely made out of old junk wood that was left over from the previous owner. One of the things I don't like about it is all of the wasted space underneath. There's just a whole bunch of open air that does nothing for me, and in my small shop I need to utilize my space better than this. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I want my new workbench to be. It's going to take up the same footprint as my current bench does, but about half of it is going to be a butcher block style top, and the other half is going to be two different flipping stations for stationary tools. So I started out by focusing my attention on the top. First, I had to sort through all of the 2x4s that I bought for this build and figure out which ones would fit the job the best. After cutting them to length, I just ran all the boards through the planer to try to clean up the surfaces a little bit to make it a little bit better for the glue up. The glue up was done in 2 different stages. In the first stage I glued together 3 different panels so that once they were dry they would still fit through my planer. Then after the fact I would glue those 3 panels to each other to have one massive top. While the top was in the clamps, I switched my attention over to the 2x6s that would make up the legs. First, I cut these to rough length, and then I ran them through the table saw to get them closer to their final dimensions. Once all the 2x6s were milled up, I had to sort them to figure out which 3 would go together to make the best leg, and my process here was just to find the ugliest piece and sandwich them in between the 2 better looking pieces, and I had to do this for a total of 6 legs. I milled up the remaining 2x4s while I was working on the legs because I needed those to become the framework for the bench, so I had them all cut to length and labeled out and glued together as well. Once the glue was dry on the first glue up of the top, I was able to take those big sections and run them through my planer to get the top and the bottom flat and parallel to each other. Then I ran each one of those blocks over the joiner to get one edge perpendicular to the faces, and then from the joiner I ran it through the table saw in 2 passes to get both of those edges perpendicular to each other, and to get all 3 of them to add up to the final width that the whole top was going to end up being. Then it was time to finally remove the planer snipe from the big top pieces and cut them down to their final length. I had to do this in small bites because the thickness of the top was actually too high for the height of my radial arm saw, so I had to sneak up on my line to finally get to my overall length. Here you can see that I actually had to put a straight edge between the fence and my bench top because the bench top was actually too tall and would run into the saw blade before I could set it back against the fence. And then it's time to do the final glue up for the big sections of the workbench top. I used some cawls over the seams to make sure that the 3 different large segments stayed perfectly flat and in line with each other. Then while the bench top was drying again, I went to work on flattening and squaring up the legs and the frame pieces. I did that by running everything over the joiner and then checking that edge against the flat top of my table saw. Once I had 2 flat and perpendicular edges on those pieces, then I switched over to the planer to get everything to final thickness and completely square all the way around. Now it's time to start cutting all of the joinery that's required for the assembly of this bench. Once I had the saw height set perfectly, then I worked on finding the exact length of the tenon. Once I had that set up just right, I set up a stop block so that I could make sure all of the legs had a consistent shoulder on them. With one saw kerf cut into all of my leg pieces, I then lined them up and put a straight edge in that saw kerf so I could check the bottoms of the legs to see if they all lined up perfectly. Once I knew I had everything lined up perfectly, then I could just start hogging out material. It would have been really nice to have a dado blade for this, but since I didn't, I just made a bunch of little passes. I tried 2 different ways for this. One was just to take 100% of the material out with a move of the saw, which was very tedious and time consuming. So secondly, I tried skipping a chunk at a time and hammering out the remaining material and then going back and smoothing out the jagged teeth in the wood that were left behind. And the finish between the two was identical, so I went with the faster way for the remaining joints. Then it's just pretty much the same story for the bottom of the legs for the 4 corner posts. And once all of the meat was hogged out, then I was able to fit the frame together and fit the legs in place and make sure that everything lined up the way it was supposed to. So at this point you can kind of see the whole bench starting to take shape. The joinery all came together just right. I checked for squareness on the legs and on the frame. It's all nice and square. Part of the reason for assembling it at this point was I wanted to check the real-world measurements against what I came up with in the computer and wanted to make sure that it was accurate. So I mapped out on this runner where the middle legs are supposed to be, the support legs that are going to hold up the outside, the middle edge of the butcher block type top. And so mapped it out on here, get these legs lined up, and then I measured across the top to see if they actually match the dimensions of the top that I built for this. And they come to within about a 1/16 of an inch, so that means that I'm coming along just fine. So now the top is back out of the clamps again, and it's time to cut the mortises for the legs. I started out by measuring exactly where I thought the mortises needed to be. The outside corners was the most crucial point. Once I had the measurements in, I put the legs down on top of it and traced those over the top to get the real world size, which was darn close to the measured size. And then it was just a matter of hogging out the material. And this was a real nail biter for me, because if I screwed this up, I'm not exactly sure how to fix it short of cutting off a chunk of top and gluing a new chunk back to it. So I took my time and was very careful about it. So I went just as deep as my router would go from the bottom side first, because if I was going to make an error, I wanted it to be on the bottom. And once I had all those cut out, then I flipped the bench over and made the same holes from the top and was able to get the holes to line up almost perfectly. Once I had the bulk of the material taken away, then I slapped on a straight edge so I could get perfect square sides in my mortises. This router base and straight edge is actually a design from Jay Bates, and I'll leave a link in the description to his plans for how to make one just like it. Then all that was left was to square off the corners of the mortises with a chisel. Then I flipped the bench top back over and put my new bench vise in place on it so that I could mark out the hole locations. It's a lot easier to do this now than when the bench is glued together and you have to work from underneath it over the top of your head trying to figure out where you want it to sit. One last interesting thing to note before I start gluing this together is this is as far as I need to disassemble it for this first glue up. This half is the side that's going to get the heavy, massive top on it, and the other half is going to end up having a flip top to it later on. And just in case, I don't think I'm going to need to, but just in case I do, I'm not gluing the back legs into the frame just yet. On the off chance I need to be able to take it back apart to do the mechanism that I have in mind. So this is as far as it's going to be taken apart to glue together, so I'm going to start slapping some glue on it and tighten everything down and call this part done. Now it's just a matter of smearing some glue in all the right places and then fitting all of the different joinery together and screwing it down permanently. The screws are just acting as clamps at this point to hold the pieces together while things dry. Later on I plan to come back and remove the screws and drill out those screw holes so I can drive dowels into place. With the frame all glued and screwed together, it was time to put some glue on the mortises and tenons for the top, set the top in place, and hammer it down into position. Well, those joints are really tight, and I am a little bit winded swinging that little hammer trying to get them knocked down. We're just about there, but I don't want to waste any more time. Like my dad always said, with a big enough hammer you can fix anything. There we go. Looks good to me. Well, that got a little bit sporting towards the end there. It took just a little bit longer to glue the whole thing up and to pound the top down than I expected it to. So I ended up resorting to a bigger hammer because I was afraid the glue was going to set up too fast on me. Anyway, you can see I added a couple of pipe clamps because these aren't completely through tenons. They're set in from the outside. I've got them clamped against the far side to pull them tight and hold them there. I tried running some screws into it and it didn't pull it quite as tight as I wanted it to, but the pipe clamps are doing the trick, and we'll just let the glue dry. All of the tenons are a little bit proud of the surface, so I'll come back through later and trim those off. But that'll be a project for tomorrow. Like I said, right now the glue's got to dry. We'll come back and trim these off. We'll flip it back over to put the wheels on the bottom, and at least it'll be mobile and I can maybe get back to some other projects. I'm winded and tired. It's time for bed. These are some large 4-inch diameter wheels that I found on Amazon. What's interesting about these wheels that I didn't know is that the lock not only keeps the wheel from turning, but it also keeps the wheel from pivoting as well. So once I have the bench set up on its wheels, I locked 2 of the wheels and tried to push it just to see how well the brakes worked, and with 2 wheels locked, it provided plenty of resistance. If I lock all 4 wheels, I should be in great shape. Now it's time to trim the tenons flush with the top of my workbench. Because I know that my flush trim saw tends to dig in too deep, I used a couple of layers of painter's tape to buy myself a little bit of leeway and keep my worktop nice. Then I used my belt sander to smooth out the tops of those tenons and take out any other rough spots and pencil marks off the top of the workbench. Then I put a couple of pocket holes into the end of the piece that I'm calling the backbone of this workbench. This piece gets wedged in between the solid top and the floating outside edge of the workbench that'll end up supporting the pivot mechanism. This piece just gets hammered down into place, then I run some screws in it to lock it down. This piece is crucial to keeping the spacing even between the solid top and that floating back end. Well, I think that's where we're going to call it quits for part 1 of this thing. That's going to be an awful lot of footage to cut together and try to narrow down. Most of it is just cutting joints and gluing stuff together, which may not be all that interesting, but there was an awful lot of it. So that's going to be part 1. I'm going to leave it with the solid top is done and the frame and the structure is all set up and ready to go. So that's going to be the next one, is put the flip tops in on both sides and put the bench vise in on the other side where I drilled the holes for, and maybe I'll put a bottom in it, I'm not sure just yet. Further down the road I'm going to build some storage drawers that go underneath this, but that's not a very high priority. At this point I just need to get the flip tops done and the planer specifically mounted to it so I can kind of wrap this thing up and get on to other pressing projects. And then come back to fine-tuning this thing a little bit later. So, if you enjoyed this, please give me a thumbs up and go ahead and subscribe if this is something new to you, if you haven't seen my channel before. Like I said, we're going to finish this out a little bit later, and this should be a pretty darn useful tool by the time it's all done. Thanks, guys.